All
Would it
right.
be too cliched to name this episode What the Frack?
Oh, well, I find that if you say we're going to talk about unconventional horizontal natural gas drilling, people go, huh? But if you just say fracking, they're like, oh, I've heard of that. And I think if you said what the frack, you do know that this is the fracking episode at the very least.
I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Hello there. Lori and I are here with another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes. We're here with Nik Gaffron, and he is here to talk about his fracking experiences, and Lori and I will be talking about how it overlaps with a book we were reading in a book club we're in called Up to Heaven and Down to Hell by Colin Jeromack, which is about fracking in Pennsylvania. So Nik, would you like to introduce yourself and why you're the competent authority for us to be interviewing about fracking?
Sure. Living in Pennsylvania, we had started hearing about fracking. And the first rumors of it, I was a construction worker at the time, and people were getting out of my trade because it was a better prospect to go and be paid to get your CDL license and drive trucks for these drilling companies and oil companies. And, you know, you just started hearing rumors of this great natural gas boom that was going to make every town in Pennsylvania rich. And
real quick, what year was this approximately?
Oh, this would have been about 2006, 2007, maybe a little earlier than that. I think I really started to get into it around 06, 07. And it just started as this thing where everybody's like, oh, we're going to make so much money. They've basically got this new technology that they've started using in like Wyoming and Texas to drill sideways through shale and use this high pressure system to break up the shale and release natural gas. And so now they can get natural gas in areas that were undrillable previously through this, what turns out to not even actually be that new of a method. It's actually been around since the 60s. And I just watched people kind of flock to it at first. It started out in the countries, like countryside, and it wasn't until it really started impacting there that anybody knew that there was anything pernicious about it, really. It wasn't really until they had really fracked all that stuff that's out away from everybody that they started to want to come into residential areas or like maybe just more rural areas, and they were coming right up to people's houses with this huge industrial process. And I think George in that book really found out, like, he's such a common tale, where they came in and they just acted like, oh, it's just this like temporary thing that we just put up a few buildings, we make a little road down there, we'll do this, it's only going to be a couple months, then we'll clean it up and we're going to plant trees and grass, and then, you know, there's nothing to worry about. Like, and they just act like it's basically nothing. And then what they find out when this process starts is that it is not nothing. It is a huge industrial process. It is loud, it is messy, they're there far longer than they will ever tell you. And while I've seen them do pretty decent reclamation efforts, at least on the surface, they also just leave things behind, and they don't show a lot of care with things like their big fracking ponds and that sort of thing. And they will just leave all this stuff open air, huge piles of silica sand that just gets blown around in the breeze. They won't take care of the liners. They use these big rubber liners in their fracking ponds, which is just a place where they put wastewater, and those will get holes in them and it'll just seep down and just like into the surface soil. And so like they won't let on to the, like, that there's anything bad that could happen. They'll just sell you on the best idea that you're going to make money, we're going to make money, we're in this together, it's going to be great. You know, you could even lease, you could put satellite dishes on the wells when they're out there, and you could charge people rent for that. And look at the opportunities we're bringing you, and look at all the money we're bringing to every town across Pennsylvania. So they came in with some big promises for sure. And that's really when it was when it really hit my area, is when we started to get involved, because it came right up to our doorstep. They wanted to start drilling in Braddock's Trail Park, which is very close to us. It's what feeds the spring house on my mother's property.
Which is near Pittsburgh, correct?
It is just outside of Pittsburgh, yes, southeast of Pittsburgh. But this was common. The Marcellus Shale region runs, you know, up into New York, sort of the whole way down through Western Pennsylvania, down into West Virginia, into parts of Ohio. It's a huge area that has all this, what they call the Marcellus Shale, that has all this natural gas, and, you know, there's also some oil and other things trapped in that shale.
So at that point, you started trying to organize with your wife, and at the time, and was it friends or just other people that were concerned, or where did you go from there?
Absolutely. It started with my wife and I, like, immediately, like, this was a place that we would go up and we would have picnics up at the waterfall up there. You know, we would just go up there and hang out. It's walking distance from where we lived, and it's just a cute little park. There's like little botany studies that go on with these flowers that only grow in this region and that sort of stuff. So it was a place that was very close to us. And a friend of mine, Travis Kerr, has property that connects to it as well. And so when we started talking about it, it was like, oh, like, you know, we can't just like let them do that in our backyard, because like we had already started hearing about horror stories of what all this really is, you know.
Which, real quick, what were these horror stories that were coming down the pipe?
Oh, well, so you would see everything from people lighting the water in their faucet on fire, you know, and some of that seems fabricated or has been debunked. But the real horror stories that are practical, that you do hear, that are very real, are people's well water. Suddenly they would have huge sodium spikes, become just undrinkable, unusable, especially for farmers who would use this water for their cattle and that sort of thing. The seismic testing process, which I can briefly get into, which is basically just these trucks. They drill down a little bit, they drop basically a stick of dynamite down in the ground, or like a quarter stick of dynamite. They set that off, and then they have sonar equipment, and that shockwaves hits the shale and bounces back up, and that way they know where these pockets of natural gas, if there is any, are down there. And that process was cracking people's foundations. Like, it's definitely well documented, like how many things just from that people were having problems in their houses where they were doing that sort of thing. And that's before anybody's building any roads or structures or drilling or anything, and it went off from there, like how intense the process is, like if you just saw a picture of the process that they call flaring, which is when they first release the gas, it's under such high pressure that they can't connect it to their lines. There's no way for them to capture that first amount of gas. And so they just have it, rip live out of the top of one of these things, and they set it on fire, and it just makes this sort of like a jet taking off that goes 24 hours a day, sometimes for weeks, until the pressure is alleviated enough that they can cap it and connect it to their lines. And like, it's bright, it lights up the whole area, it's loud, you can hear it a mile away. It's just like a horrible, just screeching noise. It's thunderous. So every step of it has something that people aren't gonna like. That's certainly when people get interested in, is when they can see it, and when it's happening to them, they certainly suddenly take an interest.
So I take it they approached your family for drilling on that property?
Oh, absolutely not.
No?
No, they would rather go through a township or a city, so that they could, what we encountered was a fair amount of glad handing and closed doors meetings that were supposed to be open to the public. But as soon as it became clear that anybody that had anything negative to say about fracking would show up, they would kind of scrub what they were going to talk about that night. And they were like, oh, well, this is just like a basic, like who's generally in favor. We're not voting on anything tonight or whatever. And then they would hold a meeting later that they wouldn't advertise, just so they could make sure that there were no activists in the room, to make sure everything goes smoothly. And, we had found out that our city commissioners were bought out for as little as $120,000.
And how much? So let's say I'm an oil exec paying people out for 120 grand. What were some of these companies making in profits?
Oh, well, there's actually two important things to note here. Not only can they come in and pay off people for very insignificant amounts of money, but they can also just go ahead and do whatever they want, because if they're caught doing something they're not supposed to be doing, the fines are so paltry that it's just a simple cost of doing business. We're talking about something like what they did in our park, which is kind of a longer story. In the end, we had found out that Chevron had already fracked the park that we were trying to save, this specific park, the one right next to us.
And park refers to like a mass of gas under the ground. Is that what that means?
No, it's like it's a park. It belongs to the township. It's maintained by the township. It's just like a little, like a walking trail.
See, that's important, because I think this is a little bit different case than what tended to be highlighted in this book, and that it sounds like they were trying to get permission to drill on public lands. Is that right? Yeah, as opposed to private lands. So this is interesting.
They will absolutely try to strike a deal if it's good for them to get on private lands, but public lands are a very easy route, because they don't have to like have some contract where they're continuing to pay you out. They can just say, like, we'll pay for these permitting fees and just do it. And look how good it is for your township. We're providing jobs. The cost of natural gas is going down, et cetera.
Gotcha.
More taxes will be being paid because of all the commerce happening in this area, and the rising tide will lift all boats.
Oh, absolutely. That's what they will sell you on. But if you do a little deeper research, you will see that any town that experienced some small boon, like specifically, I can think of a town where there was like a store that sold boots that was just loving it. They were so happy. There was got all these guys were coming in and buying, $600 metatarsal work boots while they were working in that area. And then that just dropped off, and they just went back to being the poor, depressed small town that they were. It was over as fast as it came.
And real quick on that subject, I mean, we're gonna return to that topic, but like, how can you be so short-sighted to think that, okay, something good's happening, all of these well-paid contractors are coming through and buying their fancy metatarsal boots? Why would you ever believe this is going to be like a normal thing instead of a boom and then there will be a bust? Like, do you have a sense of what's going through people's heads, if anything, during this process?
Oh, I mean, I could only blame typical American ignorance, honestly, because there's no way you could, if you knew anything about the process, you know that they're in and out within 8 months at a certain place. And then you're not going to see any of the benefit of that. Now they just have this big thing installed on your property. There's not actually going to be people there spending their money. So even you'd think the township commissioners and things like that, city councils, would have a better understanding about a boom and bust economy, but it seems that even they don't. They just look forward to maybe a small payout, or maybe, like, I hesitate to say it because you can't prove it, but maybe they are also just privately accepting money into their own hands to just go along with it.
Yeah,
Which-
that's what I was thinking. It would make more sense if they just sort of decided it was for their personal benefit.
Oh, I'm convinced. I mean, dealing with our city council, they were so sleazy the entire time. It would not surprise me at all. But again, can't really prove it. But this is all a huge tangent. Back, I was saying about these paltry fines. Chevron paid a $20,000 fine for doing that, for coming across the county line, and they didn't have the mineral rights. They weren't allowed to do the thing that they did, and they did it anyway because they don't care. Because $20,000 is nothing, and I'll tell you why. For every well that they put out there, they can drill 6 or 8 wells per pad, and a pad is like less than 100 yards by 50 yards or something. And then on just a piece of property, they can put 4 pads. Well, each one of those wells is going to produce between 12 and 16 million dollars. So that's one piece of property. And if you multiply that 16 million by 8 and then multiply that 8 by 4, you see that you're dealing with an immense amount of money just on one piece of property. So even if you had to pay a fine for every instance of drilling out 2 miles from that location and illegally fracking, what are we talking about? 32 cases of $20,000. Say if you did it on every one of them. It's nothing compared to what they got out from even just the first well.
Mm-hmm. And then, so if you're like a county, I don't even know what the term is, a commissioner or a judge, how do you not see the insane discrepancy between what you are fining people for versus like what they're getting out of it? Like, how do you only fine somebody $20,000 when they've made millions?
Well, I would have to say that that's a lot to do with that it's such a new thing. There is no legal jurisprudence that would have any advice to give anybody about what the legal ramifications would be, because this is all relatively new stuff. Like, it hasn't been a thing. Like, if you just consider oil and what they call drainage, which is where you dig your well and oil runs downhill and you're pumping oil from over there, well, that can't be helped. So there's not specifically something that says that you can't take the gas from here, but fracking is wholly different. We're talking about going down several hundred feet or several thousand feet in some cases, and then drilling horizontally for miles, sometimes like into the next township. In this case, it was across a county line. It was in a completely different jurisdiction, and that's not exactly drainage, is it? They're acting to go in that direction to actively get the gas. So in that respect, there's nothing really on the books. And then also, since it's a new process, there wasn't great science at the time from either side to show what the actual ramifications of fracking could be. Like, when we're breaking up all this shale, are we poisoning the aquifer? And if we're poisoning the aquifer, is that something that is going to filter out as it comes back up to the surface through the natural process of an aquifer working the way it does? Or is it going to like taint the entire aquifer? Now, there's so much anecdotal evidence of people's wells being poisoned and this like just toxic slurry that they use that, well, we could just refer to as frack water. It's a mixture of chemicals. There are instances of that just like coming up through farmers' fields and stuff. So, you could look at that and say, well, no, it's clearly not figured out, as it's being pushed up through the rock and soil. But there's not hard science. So like, and that's what these politicians need. They're ignorant of all the science. They're ignorant of the law because it's not on the books. It's, none of this existed before.
Right. Or put another way, these corporations are the cutting edge of like what is technologically and naturally possible. And then you have this huge lag between public and private knowledge of the consequences of what they're doing.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's so easy for them because it happens basically behind a curtain. You can't tell what's going on under the ground.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Right. And then this is in an economic context where things are already weighted to like, oh, we can make money and we can mine natural resources that will be better for everybody. Like it's hard to argue against it.
Oh, absolutely. There were people that were upset at us for spreading the information about the process. And we, in our talks, tried to be as non-biased as we could while still relating the stories, because the only positives you could put out there is like, well, yes, you can sign a contract and you will make some amount of money. Okay, so there's your balance to, well, your house could be damaged, your property could be damaged, your neighbor's property could be damaged. The ecological effects could be completely disastrous. You're going to have to suffer through this process for, at least 6 months, if not up to a year, of everything that goes on. We're talking hundreds of trucks coming past your house every day. Big work crews. We're talking about every one of those wells gets flared for it, sometimes as short as 3 days, but sometimes as long as 3 weeks. And then you've got these huge ponds.
Real briefly, can we park it right there? What you're saying with flaring is that they're literally just burning gas.
Yes. Yeah.
And there are therefore huge carbon emissions consequent to that.
Oh, absolutely. And not just that, because what else is under the ground? We're also talking about that there's oil down there, and that's more carcinogens. This is like crude oil. There's radioactive elements underground that come up with that as well. And I'm not a radiologist, but I think when you burn some of these things, you're just putting that out into the air as well, or you're at least bringing it up to the surface, and it belongs under the ground.
Just before we move on, you'd stated like early on that the technology had been around since the 60s. So I just kind of want to get a bead on when it really started getting used, because you're also referring to it and it's kind of characterized as something fairly new.
So when I say it was invented a long time ago, it is something that they have been aware of, but it hasn't been practical until modern technology has allowed them to be able to go down and then make a hard angle like that. It's a 90-degree angle at the bottom of that well to then go horizontally across. And it's something that they would have tried to do in certain circumstances, but it would have been very niche from the 60s up into the 90s. And it wasn't until newer equipment was invented that allowed them to go straight down and then turn a hard 90 and do that horizontal. And then companies capitalizing on that, realizing that they could use this high pressure system to break up the shale underground. It wasn't until then that fracking really took off. And I would say that that was in the early 2000s. I mean, it probably did start to some degree in the 90s, but I would say it really took off in the early 2000s.
Okay, so there hasn't been a lot of time for science to develop to even try to figure out what harms come from it. And then you have the impact of the oil and gas industry paying for a lot of that research through universities, and it's no wonder there's not a whole lot of like credible information about the effects of it all.
Oh, absolutely. We actually ran into a lawyer that said that he was very familiar with fracking. And then it turned out that he was very pro fracking because he was paid to be pro fracking. He didn't clearly understand what the process was anyway, but he was also completely ignorant that any environmental impact, because to him, in his mind, it's like, oh, it's just another kind of drilling. We've been drilling forever. We're not going to stop drilling. So there was no reason for him to think about it, that it's anything different or that it could harm people or harm the environment.
Although again, that has to be mortgaged by a faith that everything's fine and this is basically good.
Oh, absolutely.
like it's all of it's kind of a back rationalization from that.
I would say.
Yeah. Well, and to what extent, I mean, to play devil's advocate, to what extent was your anti-fracking group a cabal of leftist environmentalists, would you say? With your own contrary agenda?
Get into that. So I would say that it started very altruistic and well-intentioned. It was when it was just a couple of us. We were all friends, and we thought, well, we don't know enough about that. Like, we started researching it and talking to people and going to frack sites and watching what happens, and just started gaining some very intimate knowledge of it. And we started to hear all these stories, and from our perspective, we're like, well, we definitely don't want this to happen here, and we don't want this to happen anywhere. So we better start partnering with people. And so we did. We partnered with the Westmoreland Watershed Association, who had already started their own anti-fracking campaign. And we would just kind of connect with other groups. And we're like, well, we still need to focus on saving our park here. We don't want them to frack in our backyard. And so we just kind of started reaching out to people through various means. People, Travis's mom's a school teacher, so she knows a lot of people, and we just started kind of branching out. And kind of the next thing we knew, we had maybe like 12 to 16 people who were interested. Maybe if even they didn't know a lot about fracking, they knew that it wasn't bad, or they just care about the environment, and they were well-intentioned enough to like want to come and see what could be done. And I would say that we started pretty strong.
And real quick, was one of those people like George Soros, and did he have an agenda to undermine Western civilization and American capitalism? Because I don't know.
These were middle-aged soccer mom types, by and large.
Okay.
So
you went off with your motley crew.
We did go off with our motley crew, and I think what we quickly found was that this group of people was much more interested in just putting the word out there, or just saying fracking bad and we're against it. And they wanted to do things, which we did do these things. They wanted to make t-shirts, and they wanted to have a Facebook page, and they wanted to go to like a job fair and set up a thing to talk about fracking, where the kind of core group of us were going around and having talks in more academic settings, like libraries college campuses and that sort of thing, and we had like a whole presentation, and then we would have like an open dialogue at the end. Like that was, I think, as far as spreading awareness as we were interested in going, because we were mostly looking to network with people that had a greater understanding or had access to legal resources, which is the route we were really wanting to go, wherein my wife and I and Travis were concerned. Like we wanted to look to see what we could do to have a judge like put a moratorium on this, like get it stopped, see what we could do to sue the city council and say, you cannot do this here, and that sort of thing. And we wanted to do anything we could to buy time. And meanwhile, we had this contingency of people who were supposed to be on our side, but were really just a giant distraction because they wanted to go to the parade and they wanted to go, set up at the local baseball game and just, put up a sign that's like, we're against fracking.
Were these like soccer moms the usual suspects as far as, getting involved in every cause that came along, or?
Certainly some of them. It also resulted in a fair amount of infighting when people wouldn't agree with things. Everybody had their own way that they wanted to do things, and I would call most of them pointless.
Real quick, is it possible to profile the people who cared about this other view, like their other views? Like, were they solid Democrats, or was it, like, by American terms, a more diverse coalition?
Well, they're certainly all liberals. Yeah, I mean, whether they identified as Democrats or liberals or even moderate, they had just this the typical liberal zeal of like, I don't like a thing and I want it to change, but I'm not going to take any practical steps to change it.
Mm-hmm. But they do want their voice to be heard and everybody to know they're on the right side of history.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
I want to wear t-shirts and have a Facebook page. That's important.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And real quick, do they have any like sort of sense of irony about their position, or like the likely futility of all this, or have they really drank the Kool-Aid?
I sincerely doubt it. I think that they probably have gone on to say like, oh, I stood up against fracking, like, and just continue to kind of just revel in this nice thing that they had done.
So how long did it take for you to kind of get thoroughly like disappointed with that?
I was willing to keep fighting the good fight, but the news that the company that was doing the drilling was a company called Huntley and Huntley. When they started doing their seismic testing to see where they would want to place their pads, they had discovered that it had already all been completely drained. And that's when they found that it had been drained by Chevron from the other side of the Youghiogheny River. I'd say at that moment, my ex-wife was so heartbroken that she didn't want to live in Pennsylvania anymore. She felt like, we were the only people that cared. We were the only people that really tried to push this thing and not be distracted by these stupid going to fairs and running a Facebook page. And honestly, she was the only one that was willing to go to a fracking site and just yell at these people and give them shit about the thing that they're doing. Like, do you not realize that you people are criminals and you're destroying the world, kind of stuff? Which, I mean, there's an element of futility to that as well. But I think there's more to making the people that are doing the thing feel bad and perhaps quit their job than there is to say like, oh, look how nice we're being. At that point, it was like, I want to move as far away from here as we possibly could. So we moved to Portland, Oregon.
Oh, wow. Mm-hmm. That's the other end. Wow.
Yes.
Lights were put off.
And would you say, was then there a further irony that some of your natural gas use in Portland probably flowed from Pennsylvania?
Well,
over the years,
it is hard to say. There's a fair amount of fracking going on all over the country. Mm-hmm. The reason it was such a hot button issue in Pennsylvania is because Pennsylvania is very much a place where one small town connects to the next. So after they had done all the state lands, after they had done all the township lands, they wanted to come into private lands and come right up to people's houses with this. So that's why it gained the notoriety it gained in Pennsylvania, because they're still doing fracking in Wyoming, Montana, Texas. I mean, I imagine in every state there's some level of fracking going on.
So that's kind of like maybe the subtext of that book by Mack is, the first step was undermining everybody by doing that on the public lands first, and then they start encroaching on the private lands. That's a piece that he didn't really, I don't think he dwelled on that very much, but that makes sense. Because once the public lands go, then it becomes, well, that much harder to say no, right? Because they've already messed up your precious, parks and rivers and everything.
Sure. If they had done it in the opposite direction, if they'd have come up into people's backyards first and got a lot of people pissed off, then there would be a lot more people saying like, well, I don't want you doing that over on state game lands 92. You came and did this horrible thing in my backyard. I don't want you doing it somewhere else. There would I wouldn't say everybody, but certainly there would be more people interested in fighting the process as a whole.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you know what that park looked like now? What does it look like?
Braddock's Trail?
Yeah.
Well, visibly, you don't see a lot on the surface, honestly. That's part of the problem is, what you see looks no different. Unless you're specifically looking for the evidence of fracking, you can't see it with your eyes. So still kind of looks the same, honestly. Now, if you go and test the water around there, you'll see that it is perhaps unusable in parts, but it is perhaps still usable in other places, which they'll point to and say, like, look, we didn't mess anything up because like this is still clean water over here.
And would you say so there the effects are more like occult and hidden? Can you see effects like at the communal or like health level? Like is the community more contentious because of how the fracking handled, or like did cancer rates go up or anything like that?
Well, I'd say the social effects that are left behind are that towns are realizing they've been duped. Anybody that was excited about all this money they were going to make realizes that work was just temporary. Those people have all gone back, and probably to not even positions in some cases that paid as well or were as desirable as what they had before, because now they've got to restart their career. Or maybe they've moved on and used that CDL to get a better job, maybe in some cases. So maybe there have been people that benefited, but I would say for the most part, like that little bit of money has certainly all ran dry by now, as like the wells they're all already there. There's still new fracking going on in Pennsylvania, but not like it was. Like they've really hit it hard. They got everything that they wanted to get. It's connected to their pipelines, or it's trucked out, as the case may be, and it's all set up already, and they're done and gone, and we are in the bust. So sort of socially, I'm sure, socially and economically, you would see the effects left behind today. As far as health concerns, I imagine that you're going to be able to point to a graph, within the next few years, even of, certainly cancer rates spiking. Anybody that lived near to this stuff, it's not new knowledge that fine particles such as this silica sand that they use is like a highly powerful carcinogen, and they would truck this stuff in, they'd put it in big piles, and you could just watch it blowing across people's houses. So you will absolutely see a level of increased lung cancer. It remains to be seen now, but I think we're looking at it.
Sure. Which we blew past this, but could you clarify, like, I don't think people understand how fracking uses tons and tons of water.
So the gist of the process of fracking is first you'll have all this bureaucracy where people come in and they make their deals and they get their permits and they sign their contracts. And then once a contract is signed, and let's just say it's somebody like George, and a salesman came up, knocked on his door and said, "Hey, boy, you've got a perfect piece of land here for this unconventional hydraulic, horizontal, natural gas drilling." And they'd be like, "Oh, what's that?" They're like, "Oh, we call it fracking." You're like, "Oh, I've heard of fracking." And and they would tell you all the money you're going to make, and they would tell you like the gist of the process, like, "Oh yeah, we're going to come, we're going to put a little road back here. There's going to be a few temporary buildings while we do the drilling. We'll pour our pads, we're going to do the drilling." They will always leave out things like the storage ponds. They will always leave out things like the big piles of silica. They'll leave out anything that sounds bad, is what we encountered time and time again.
And real quick, what is a storage pond?
Well, I'll get to that.
Okay.
So what they'll do is first they'll come in and they have these big thumper trucks is what they are. And these trucks kind of thump the ground, and that tells them about where the shale formations are. And then they will move on to a little bit more heavy duty of a seismic testing, where they will drill down, they will drop a quarter stick of dynamite down in there, it'll blow up, and then they'll see where these pockets are, and that's what they want to aim for, is being close to as many pockets as they can when they drill horizontally into the shale. So they'll come back in, they'll set up all their storage situations, which are oftentimes open air. It's just piles of their materials, or just barrels of the chemicals that they use. And they will truck in boy, I wish I had the numbers available, but hundreds of thousands of gallons of water in tanker trucks. And once they've done the drilling, they've bored their holes, they will feed a line down in, and they will use a mixture of mostly water, silica, which it gives it some grit, and these proprietary chemicals, which they will not tell you what any of them are, to under extremely high pressure, they'll pump it in, and they'll kind of sort of like an impact gun. They'll pump it and hit it. They'll back off the pressure. They'll pump it and hit it, and it'll break up the shale, and it'll start releasing all the gas. When that happens, eventually they'll just start pumping it, and they'll use the water pressure to fill as much of the cavity as they can. So now the natural gas is under extremely high pressure. The gas will come back up the line, and it'll come out like a tower that probably stands about 50 to 60 feet in the air, and it will just erupt natural gas along with anything else that's under there. The water will come out, and it will get pumped to these big frack water storage ponds, which some of them are pretty huge. If they have the space, they'll do one large one. If they don't, they'll split it up. They have about a 2-inch thick rubber mat that goes down. They'll just dig out like a temporary pond. They'll line it with this rubber mat, and they will just dump this polluted frack water onto the surface on top of this rubber mat into this pond. As the gas starts coming out, the way it's dealt with is, again, it's under such high pressure that they'll have to light it on fire, and they will burn it for days to weeks. And they will repeat that process 8 times per pad, and on as many pads as they have space for back in the area where they're doing the bulk of the work. Mm-hmm. And in that time,
and just to help people picture, so a pad is basically like an entryway into the earth where they can branch out in multiple areas to try, and it's kind of like an underground launching pad. Is that what you mean?
Yes, absolutely. It is like a launching pad. It's you know, it's where the machinery will be set up and bolted to the ground, because we're talking about huge pumps. You know, these pumps with these giant fan motors on them, and they also are just loud. Every bit of this process is just chaos. Like if you're near it, it's worse than any construction site you can imagine.
It sounds like some shit out of Fern Gully or Avatar or something like that.
Oh, it's intense. I mean, so you're not going to see this black smoke because natural gas burns clean. You'll see little puffs of black smoke as things like crude oil come up. But for the most part, it burns pretty clean. So it just, like, if you saw it from a distance, you'd be like, oh, look at that. The beautiful fire of American industry doing good for all of us, you know? But when you're right up next to it, it sounds like a massive flamethrower. And just lights up the whole area.
And so they keep that plume going for several days until what? Until like the pressure goes down far enough that they can kind of put a cap on it and then start controlling it and pumping it out, right?
Yes, that is correct. They need to get as much of the liquid out of there as they can in that time, and get it to where now they've just got this big reservoir of natural gas, and they can siphon it off in a controlled manner, because it's under extremely high pressure. Like, you know, imagine what it must take to break rocks, you know?
Yeah, right. Oh, thank you.
And then from there, it goes into pipes that then go into, I would assume, sort of like centralized areas where they can then further truck the gas or pipe it off. Is that right?
Sometimes, especially if it's a bigger operation, they will go through the trouble of running pipes out. If not, they have like storage tanks, and they will keep those trucks coming and going as long as it takes until they can either hook something up, or if it's a smaller operation, they might just continue using the trucks because it's not that expensive compared to what they're making
On the gas.
Itself. So
and just, I mean, we're really getting into the weeds, but I think people really need to understand like how complicated and expansive these operations are. So when we say there are pipes running gas, like how thick and what are these pipes made of?
Well, it depends. If a company like Chevron will definitely go through the trouble of hiding its pipes as best it can.
Okay.
A smaller company might, because they don't want people having an uprising. You know, they don't want people saying anything.
They don't want people like your ex not being moderated by you. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Allegedly.
They want to be out of sight and out of mind. But smaller companies will run like about a 6-inch steel pipe, and you know, they'll often do that next to train tracks or rivers or like places where you don't see them. They're already kind of clear cut. It makes it real easy to just you know, whenever they hit a road or they have to go over the train tracks, they can just go straight up over as high as they need and come back down and keep running their pipe, and still kind of keep it out of view. And then like all it takes then is just a relationship with, you know, whoever owns the clear cut for the power line that's there, the clear cut for the railroad or whatever it is. You know, they just have to make one contract there. So they'll tend to run the pipes in those areas. But at a certain point, they will have to bring it up to where it's at. And if that's in like a semi-rural or residential area, like you will see these gigantic pipes doing what they do. They are highly visible. They do have things like relief valves on them. So if things get a little high pressure, you will smell natural gas coming out of those relief valves. Yeah, they're just sitting there highly visible. You know, they paint them once, but after the paint wears off, when you kind of see older gas lines, I'm not sure if you've ever been out and about and just seen surface gas lines. Like eventually they start to rust and they break down, and things happen.
Sure. But so what this means is to support even doing this, there are steel plants like making steel out of iron and whatever else it's made out of. And you have all of these plants pumping out giant pumps so that they can be moved to Pennsylvania just to siphon off this gas.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, also just trucking companies. A lot of this is not done by gas companies so much as drilling companies. You know, Halliburton has a large drilling division that will come out and just do deep well drilling, and kind of set the stage for that sort of thing. So that there's operations big and small. Like I said, in my hometown, it was a company no one had ever heard of called Huntley and Huntley. And they were just, you know, contractors. They would subcontract out all the drilling. They would subcontract out the extraction. You know, everybody involved in this was a subcontractor if you were working through them. You know, maybe an outfit like Chevron probably worked a little bit different. They probably had more processes in-house. But there was, you know, lots of different ways to approach this. It wasn't just gas companies. It was also drilling companies have a large interest in this.
Okay.
So is the spoiler alert that the moms at the parades didn't stop the fracking?
Oh yes. The parades did nothing. I would say nobody, I mean, much like you and I have found in the world of nonprofit community organization and farming, Spencer, you would not be surprised to know that no matter how much information you could give a crowd of people, most of them would not be, even if they were sympathetic, not be joining your cause.
So like, were there any large organizations like Sierra Club or something like that that were looking to spend money on legal assistance for people like you, citizens like you, that wanted to look into like legal angles, like lawsuits? Was anybody like offering?
And the largest group that offered to do anything with us, which helped us split the cost when we started talks with a lawyer to try to get an injunction, which ended up not happening because we had found out that we had already lost.
They drank your milkshake.
They drank our milkshake, yes. You know, like, was that Westmoreland watershed. You know, they had been in operation for a long time. Like, fracking wasn't their only concern, but you know, they were the only ones that had any sort of like good connections for lawyers. The lawyer that we got was through them, and they helped us pay some of the starting costs until the point where we were forced to give up.
That, I mean, I don't know anything about Westmoreland Watershed Association, but just by the name, I'm guessing it's not a huge like national charity. It's a regional thing, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And I'm just wondering why some of these environmental groups aren't or weren't involved in that. It seems like a very practical way to proceed for citizens. You would think there would be more organized, like money raising for legal help.
Yeah, you know, I would certainly agree with you. I sure wish there was. And honestly, I felt like everything was always happening so fast that the gas companies had such great leverage. They were always a step ahead to begin with, and that it was happening at such a great speed that there was no way, everybody's heads were spinning. There was no way anybody could organize fast enough, because, as you know, organization can be a real slog when everybody's got their own opinions and nobody wants to just come together and remember what the core thing is here. And everybody's got their own little groups, and it was hard to try to bring these people together. Like, you know, we would try to communicate as much as we could, but they'd always like, oh, well, we have our own thing we're dealing with out here. And, you know, maybe somebody would ask for help from us, and we would either do that same thing, or like we'd come and try to show up at their event or whatever, or their town hall meeting, just to like make a presence known, you know, put more butts in the seats, so, you know, for the people that were most organized to be able to stand up and say, like, do you, any of you city council members, understand anything about this process? And time again, what we saw was no. They had no idea what any of it was. They just like, oh, drilling, you need a permit, we'll approve this permit, thanks for the money.
Yeah, I think that's really telling that there isn't more really good organized opposition amongst the many groups that are out there, who have, they're the only ones who have like the organizational ability and money to be able to oppose the corporate money. I mean, other citizens can never do it on their own. These places have far too much political and legal power. So your only hope would be if there was already organizations in place that were like, who wants to sue? We've got lawyers. That's what happens with other causes. Right?
Sure. Yeah. I would say a 6 or 7 year blitz of other causes. If we're talking about saving the whales, for example, you have hundreds of years of whaling, and eventually people start to get rallied around the cause of saving the whales, right? But with fracking, it was like, first of all, we had to figure out what it is. Like, we're like, okay, so it's drilling. Okay, well, doesn't sound great. We're making a mess underground, and it's not until you start figuring out what their processes is, and they're not willing to tell you. Like there was I think only one time where we went and we talked to the guy at the gate, and he had some knowledge about what was going on, and he was just, like, a friendly guy. He was willing to share some information. I imagine if any of his superiors knew what he had said to us that day, he would have gotten in trouble. Like, nobody else was ever forthcoming on a person-to-person level. A lot of what we figured out was through other people who had to go looking into it, or they happened to know somebody that knew about it. Like, there wasn't a wealth of information online about it. When we put together our presentations, we had to go take our own pictures. Like, we couldn't use stock photos from Google for our PowerPoint presentation. We had to go to fracking sites and take pictures of the frack ponds, of the equipment, of all the damage they would do, of the flaring, of everything, or like maybe flaring was one thing that you could find pictures of because people were enthralled by fire.
So all this said, can we talk about Chapter 6, indentured George Hagemeyer, all that, and how that reads to you? Because you say you've encountered a lot of Georges in your organizing attempts.
Mm-hmm.
So like how? So I would say Chapter 6 is. So my summary of it would be it chronicles primarily this character named George Hagemeyer, who is this guy, doesn't have a lot of money, owns some family land. The fracking company comes around, says it's all going to be easy, and then he finds out there were all these strings attached, and it wasn't quite as simple as they made it appear. And it was really annoying and frustrating to me reading this article, because he's kind of this bipolar character. And one pole of him is he views himself as an individual, a rugged American. He needs to be a steward of his land. He wants to pass it on to his family. But on the other hand, his farm or his rural land, which I think used to be a farm but isn't anymore, doesn't generate much money. And so he's put in this situation where basically, okay, Anadarko was, I believe, the company. Anadarko can come and frack my land, and this is how he imagines, delusionally, I think, that this is how the family legacy is going to be maintained. And what's so annoying to me is he doesn't see the irony that he wants this independent family homestead, but he wants it to be financially sustained by gas revenues by an international energy company. And that is just so crazy to me that I don't know. It makes me incredibly uncomfortable. Maybe I'm too sensitive to these more abstract questions, but Nik, what do you say to any of that?
I think that might also have something to do with the American dream, that you could take the money that you made from doing this business venture where you're having somebody frack on your land, and even if you understand the exact amount of money you made, you knew you were going to make $400,000 by signing this contract, just hypothetically. You would think like, oh, as an American, I can take that $400,000 and enter into the free market with it. And I could, I could buy stocks and bonds. I could start a business. I could use that money to search other new revenue streams, or bring my farm back, or, any number of things. It's just the dream, right? It's the idea
of an endless frontier
to start, bringing the dream back to life. You know what I mean? So
Mhm.
maybe if there is a level of just like stupidity and ignorance to think that I'm gonna have them frack and that's gonna set my family up for life. There's probably also an element of like, well, I can parlay that money into something else, into new revenue streams, and this is like my big break to get back on top, right?
Sure. And even it wasn't in this chapter, but earlier in the book they talk about how when he had all these ideas like, I'm going to give 95% of the money away, I'm not even going to hold on to it, and then like day by day he gets less and less altruistic and more like, I got to face reality, I got to look after myself. All of which like is what it is, but on the one hand he's basically a selfish individual, and on the other hand he imagines he's this like world historic magnanimous philanthropist. And
well, he's never seen that kind of big, easy money too. And I think that most Americans would have trouble. I once talked to an accountant, who basically told me, I don't know, maybe it was a lawyer. Anyway, they told me that most people who get multi-million-dollar settlements almost immediately squander the whole lot of it. They don't know what to do with it. And most people dream of that kind of money and dream about what they're going to do with it, but they have no like practice or ability to like financially handle, or like emotionally maturity wise handle that amount of money, nor do they really understand like how much it really is. So like it's a fantasy to think that you could stake your family's like generations later their fortune on fracking money for sure, but like for people who've never had anything like that kind of money, they don't even know how to gauge it. So, I'm sure for a lot of them being approached like this, it's like deer in the headlights. Oh my God, what? How many zeros? And it's like they can't think from there on out.
Sure. I would say that we did run into one guy while we were doing a presentation at a library who did have some good knowledge and foresight. He was very pro fracking. He thought that we were going to be there to be pro fracking with him, and he was surprised to learn some of the things that we were talking about. However, when we talked to him, we saw that he was much different from George, and that he had the foresight to go and get a good lawyer and to go over his contracts and to make sure that he was getting like a percentage in perpetuity of everything that was coming out of his land. Like he had enough knowledge to know what he actually had under the ground and what it was worth and what he could really get for it. And he was in a position where he could afford a lawyer to go over this contract and negotiate the contract and make it more equitable to him. So, in the end, like, the gas company's making millions and millions, and he's getting a very small percentage of that, and he's trading, his own air quality, his own water quality, and like really his land for that.
But he at least jockeyed for more of a share of the profits of these wells.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Which the irony is, a lot of these individuals who claim that they're savvy and they know what's up are really being taken advantage of, even on their own terms.
Sure. Yeah. I would say most of the people that enter into these contracts are just like George. They're just hapless fools that are excited to get a little bit because they spent their whole lives thinking that they deserved more. You're promised so many things living in America, and then when you don't get them, then you feel like you're entitled to them, and then something like this comes along, and I'm sure George wasn't getting $1 million out of his contract. I don't know what his contract was, but it wasn't as life-changing of an amount as I'm sure he thought it would be. And they enter into these things oftentimes for just a lump sum, just because they're excited to get that money. Maybe he needs to fix his house, like he's got medical debt, whatever, and you picture that amount of money and you just go for it. Sounds great. I'll sign wherever. I'll sign twice.
Well, and real quick, I wanted to read a choice paragraph from this chapter, because part of the wider narrative of the book is that and maybe I guess speak to this before we get into it, but Gerald Matt chronicles how in Pennsylvania there's this still American ideal of like the rugged individualist living in the mountains, a law unto himself. How much is this in the culture where you're from?
It's huge. Southwestern Pennsylvania, much like West Virginia and southeastern Ohio, is coal country. It's everybody is the descendant of a steel mill worker. They are descendants of coal miners. These are like roughneck kind of guys, and that gets passed down from the generations. Absolutely. So yeah, there's a very strong, exactly what you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's this chapter, this paragraph. It says, George's modest acts of resistance against Anadarko only underlined his impotence. He pulled up a thin yellow pipeline marker. He pushed Anadarko to mount a camera along the access road to record alleged breaches of contract, like workers leaving a pile of cyclone fencing outside the right-of-way. He strung cones together with plastic chains along the edge of his field to remind trucks not to drive on the grass. Quote, they won't let me put a board with nails in it. And my lawyer didn't think that would be a very good idea, George laughed. I do, and I think it would work, unquote. Whenever he felt, to me, this is the crux of the matter. Whenever he felt acutely wronged, George called his lawyer, perhaps the clearest indicator that this self-styled mountain man, who presented himself, in the words of Horace Kephart, as a law unto himself, had been defanged by his lease. And that to me summarizes this whole chapter about a guy who's been defanged, castrated, whatever metaphor you want. And a character like that having to be a pawn in like an industrial supply chain to extract gas off of his land. It is just such like a surreal picture. And it's like almost too much for me. That's not really a question. What do you say to that?
I just in the words, I could see why you feel that way. Imagine you're standing on George's back porch with him, and there's just this towering inferno and trucks and machinery and just a cacophony. It could be 10 o'clock at night. It could be midnight, middle of the night, and you're completely lit up like the sun is out, because 200 yards away from you is a big tower fracking.
The real Old Faithful.
A real Old Faithful. And you're standing next to George, and George is probably about ready to snap. You can probably see the red veins in his eyes. You probably can't sleep at night. Like, there's a documentary called The Triple Divide, which is about an area in Pennsylvania known as the Triple Divide. It is an area where 3 aquifers meet, and this feeds just about every river in Western Pennsylvania. And when they fracked at the Triple Divide, they caused a lot of problems. And they go around and they interview a lot of people. I would highly recommend checking it out. Triple Divide, it's called.
Definitely will. But before we get off this topic, poll, do you guys feel sorry for George when you're standing there on his back porch, or do you feel contempt for him?
I mean, both, I guess. And more. I feel like those are not the two. I guess I feel over that there's this tragic futile feeling that like, and not just sort of like the internal contradictions and pettiness of him as a character, but also this absurd situation he's like a cog in. And then this sense of, does he even understand, or is the nature of being a cog in something like that these characters have less of a comprehensive view as we do? Like, as they're going through it, do they have even the barest idea of what is happening and what the wider implications are? I don't even know. There are just so many feelings coming out of that vision. I don't know. What do you think, Nik?
I would say that I also feel a bit of both. I would say that I have some compassion for George. because it's not just his ignorance of what exactly fracking is, and now he's in this sticky situation. He was obviously also ignorant of the greater implication, and I think that just reflects on society as a whole. It's where our education system is, and even though George wasn't specifically taught about environmental impact, like I think the larger problem is he was never taught to think critically or to look at the broader picture, because that's not what our educational system does. So I think George in some ways is a victim, and he's relatable because he's not the only one. George's story is so common.
And real quick, can I just push back on this here? Here's where Lori tells me that this is too much to ask of people, but like, why is it hard to imagine that a multinational energy company mining resources hundreds, thousands of miles underground is going to cause unintended consequences that might be bad? Like, to me, you don't have to be like a genius to have a sense that this is likely. But
in the case of fracking, I would say it has a lot to do with that. You can't see it. If somebody came and they set up like a kiln for processing coal, and they made a big black cloud in your backyard, and you saw that down the road at your neighbor's house, you would say, oh, well, I don't want them doing that here, you know. But when what you saw of fracking, just like, you know, off in the distance, you saw that they were doing something tucked out into the woods out of sight, and then somebody got a check, you know. And when the salesman comes up and he doesn't tell you any of the things, and you have no idea what the environmental impact is, and even if you did, when you look out at your land, you're still seeing trees and grass, and you're not really sure if you were wrong or not about what the impacts actually are.
I was just going to say, I agree with Nik about the education factor. You know, like what you're talking about, Spencer, is just kind of common sense and skepticism, both of which our education system does not at all encourage, because we're training people from grade school on to be cogs, to be a part of some process. And that's been our education system for quite a long time. And so we don't value people in the education system with a broader, deeper education, even in, you know, like, even if you never went past high school, we don't give them a lot of history. We don't give them a lot of literature. We don't give them a chance to develop that kind of skepticism and common sense, because we don't need that in our economy. So, you know, they don't get into the habit of sitting back and going, what's wrong with this picture? So just to put in a word for George.
Sure. I would say not only are people taught to be a cog in the machine, they're taught to do it for money, because capital is the most important thing.
I agree.
which isn't either, we've talked about this on the podcast before, but I think part of the tragedy and why feelings like contempt are very understandable at a human level, but they're another kind of human response to this fact that you have individual human beings like George that are caught up in this way more complicated like chain of industries. And it's all interrelation, whether it's like the steel plants that are creating the pipes, to the energy companies that are getting at the gas, to the finance capital that is pushing for this gas, to the speculators who want to be able to like exploit market fluctuations in the gas. That all of this is happening, and then on the ground there's a dude like George being offered a check for whatever like weird historical settler colonial like historical reasons that like he legally owns this part and they need his say so. It's like absurd, and you have this little cog who is part of like a superhuman in the sense of like it's just beyond the scope of what he considers understandable or normal. And what do you do in the face of that storm? I don't know. Yeah, does that make sense?
Sure. I'd say most people just crumble in the face of that because they don't know what to do.
Which is totally understandable. Hence, like my sort of light bulb moment when I realized that there isn't probably any massive like organizational effort to sue these people. And short of that, there really, what could there be that would stop that? Since the politicians are all in favor of it, or at least not opposing it. I would say pretty much everybody's in favor of it. So, yeah, there's no stopping it. Certainly not a band of citizens who are trying in some way to deal with it at the local level.
Yeah, ultimately, everything we did was futile, even if we had known that we had already failed because Chevron, quote unquote, drank our milkshake. I don't believe that it could have ever gone anywhere just with this little grassroots that we were doing in North Huntington, even connecting with other smaller groups. Like, without the help of big money lobbyists that are on the side of stopping climate holocaust, I don't see a way working in the system that we're working in to oppose any of this.
And it's this on the top down.
Right. And it's this is why, like, why people like Marx and the Frankfurt School haunt me, because what I think we're witnessing is like foreclosure of Enlightenment dreams. Like, the idea is we're going to have technology and we're going to use it to better the human condition. And we will develop sort of conscious societies that can direct this technology towards at least their own self-declared ends. And certainly those would be positive ends that are good for at least some of us, or at least most of us. And what we're seeing is like, but there is we can figure out how to drill thousands of miles underground and make these like proprietary cocktails of water and fracking fluid to blast, but we won't ask, what is all of this energy going to be directed towards? Because the abstract domination of capital says, well, it's going to be sold to whoever would buy it, so a profit can hopefully be made, and then we'll expend that money to do something. Don't ask what it is, because hopefully it's going to make money for somebody. And like, how do you stop this thing?
Well, that's not even the way they present it. They would say that we're doing so much good because we're heating every American home this winter. Nobody is going to be cold in their house because of this sacrifice that you're making.
Mm-hmm.
And the sacrifice that the environment ultimately is making.
And we're creating jobs, which they are. They're just not necessarily permanent jobs. And then there's the ancillary jobs, supplying them all their stuff, and those are jobs. And a lot of stuff just gets done. And, I mean, from the politicians, that's what they'll tell you is we created, this many hundred or thousands of jobs for our state. That's good too.
But so Nik, imagine hypothetically an alternative dimension where the liberal soccer moms who, instead of making Facebook groups and going on parades, imagine they were able to relate to their conservative mountaineer rural neighbors. And they were able to explain why actually the fracking is going to cause all of these unintended environmental consequences. And what we really need to do is usher in a kind of a narco-communist permaculture utopia where we will be able to work together to take care of each other in nature instead of just exploit each other so that we can have our houses warmed in the winter.
But how do I charge my iPad?
Sure. I mean, is that a total and utter utopian pipe dream?
Well, I don't think so. There's a lot of schools of thought there. This is a whole different conversation, I think. But I mean, like, do you think that, do you think that if the Bolsheviks knew that steel mills create huge amounts of carbon and that carbon's going to rain back down and it's going to poison the soil, do you think that they would have not gone to Magnitogorsk and, built a whole city out of steel mills? Or would the revolution have demanded that they pour themselves into this and build a nation, damn the cost to the environment. Like, you know, you could certainly argue that at that time there was probably very little thought that that black smoke would do so much damage to the future, right? But like, had they known, would that have changed anything for them? You know, and like, to talk about these hill people that are out there in the coal mines and everything, you know, they were just doing it. They'd go down in the holes and they would get black lung and they would die at 50. Like, that's what your father did, and that's probably what you're going to do too. And I think they would just resign themselves to that. So maybe it's not that people, I mean, I'm sure that there are plenty of people who do learn from their experiences, but like, when we look at the evidence, we got to say that most people just resign themselves and don't look at the bigger implications, and just want to think that everything's fine and not really challenge any of these things, and just accept whatever consequences come their way. Because I mean, just look at today at large. You know, you got this big garbage patch in the Pacific, and we know that carbon in the atmosphere is killing us, and we're still hemming and hawing about it. You know, we've got 40 years of data, and still there can be no conclusion. So like, it's a tall order for academics. What is the Pennsylvania coal miner's son gonna do?